of the American Civil War, reenactments are taking place across America to mark the 150th anniversary of crucial battles at Gettysburg and Vicksburg and President Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery. But how much have the ideas that started war evolved since then? Our guests are Peniel Joseph, history professor at Tufts University, and attorney Horace Cooper. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for being with us. I do appreciate your time. Professor Joseph, I'd like to start with you. Give us a bit of a history lesson. We all know that a major issue of the Civil War was slavery, but there were other issues that led to the war. Can you kind of do a primer and remind us of the times?
Oh, absolutely. When we think about 1861 to 1865, a huge part of the Civil War beyond slavery, obviously slavery is at the crux of this, is really the notion of federal versus states' rights. Basically, the notion of what kind of powers does the federal government have to not just abolish slavery, but to tell individual states what to do. So when we think about the Confederacy, the notion of saying, look, the federal government cannot tell us what to do with groups of people they were defining as legalized property, this species of property, chattel slaves, is really at the heart of the Civil War as well. When we think about what's going on between 1861 and 1865 as well, we're thinking about the industrialization of America and really what role is the South going to play in that industrialization? Is it going to be ruled by unfree labor, or is it going to have a free labor force that has to compete with northern states that are utilizing free labor? So there's really a contest over what kind of democracy the United States is going to be. But beyond the issue of slavery, it is a struggle over power and who has the power. Is it a broad federal government that has power over states, or are each individual states sovereign to themselves?
Horace, doesn't that all sound familiar? Of course, there have been great changes since then. Of course, we no longer have slavery, among other things. But how much change has there really been, both in the societal temperament and atmosphere, as well as the atmosphere of our laws?
Well, there's been a lot of change, but I guess I want to quibble a little bit with the characterization, because I think it was fairer to call this a conflict between how much control government had over individuals versus whether individuals were all, under the law, allowed to be autonomous and free. And that is a conflict that still continues today. At that point, many in the southern states, and particularly the people who identify themselves as Confederates, believed that government ought to be able to single out certain individuals and treat them as if they had no rights, control them in every absolute way imaginable. And it was the Federalists who argued that there were limits that ought to be placed on that, and that they had a conflict over whether that kind of control would exist. Today, we don't have that absolute type of control being contemplated, but we still have a battle over whether or not government ought to be extremely coercive, or whether or not there are certain limits that ought to be placed on government.
I got to say, it seems like, everything old seems new again. Joseph, do you get the idea that in some ways we are regressing in terms of in terms of race relations, in terms of the progressiveness as a society and how we view individuals?
Well, I think it's always a conflict. I think when we think about the heroic period of the civil rights movement between 1954 and 1965, again, there was this conflict between federal government and states' rights. In that case, the federal government won. The Supreme Court passed the desegregation decision. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. I think that by the 90s and into the 21st century, we continue to relitigate these arguments. The Attorney General of the United States just made a major speech about the rights of criminal defendants who have been prosecuted under the drug laws. Many of them are African Americans who are underneath what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow and are victims of mass incarceration. So I think that when we think about race relations in America, it's never progressing in a linear fashion. It's always progressing in fits and starts, and it always very much resembles the struggles that were fought during the Civil War and the struggles that were fought during the Civil Rights Movement. So I think that what's very interesting about democracy is that democracy is very, very complicated, and there's always a struggle over what is your vision of American democracy. Is it a robust federal government that can protect people's rights, or is it states having the right to do things like have affirmative action or not have affirmative action, have their own gun laws like stand your ground? Or can the federal government say, well, no, we want a more uniform vision of American democracy?
Yeah, we all remember those classes that we had back in history, and that I'm sure you're even still teaching now, Peniel, about federal rights versus states' rights. But Horace, let me bring you back into this. It seems like in some ways legally we've taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Peniel just mentioned the Voters' Right Act of 1965 that was passed then. However, of course, Section 4 was pulled back with Supreme Court decision that was made this year. How astounding is that to you?
Well, actually, I wasn't astounded by it. I was very pleased with the outcome. But I will add, again, this is why the conflict isn't well defined. If the conflict, the nature of the differences philosophically is one of federal versus state, we miss a great degree of the nature of the conflict. Jim Crow can't happen without government authority and government intrusion. Now, many people want to look at it and say it was a state phenomenon, and they forget renowned progressive Woodrow Wilson was the first president to actually announce that Washington, D.C. was going to be resegregated after almost a generation, 30 or 40 years of it not being that way. The courts, which are federally run, the Supreme Courts, have a mixed record. You want to talk about Plessy Ferguson, you want to talk about Brown v. Board. What the coercive utopians give, they're able to take away. The real question ought to be who is exhibiting the authority and how does that interfere with individual autonomy. There are abuses of that have happened at the state level. There are abuses of that have happened at the federal level. The better message, I think, and the lesson to be learned from the Civil War is that we should all be united behind individual autonomy and freedom as opposed to government solutions, however coercively they occur at the federal or state level.
Very quickly, like in 10 seconds or less, Peniel, what's your response to what Horace has just said? Is that the real question?
Well, I think the bigger question is really the federal government historically has been the defender of individual rights, especially for African Americans. So the federal government, we need a final arbiter that can say, look, slavery is bad.
All right.
Jim Crow is bad.
We're going to have to stop right there. Peniel Joseph, Horace Cooper, thank you both so much. Do appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. We'll see you again tomorrow.